Hello and most welcome to 940. And since we got into the zest here, let's continue with Susie Vrobel and her fractal dimensions of time. We now reach page 54. Sorry about the somewhat noisy character of the square I'm sitting at right now. It is hard to believe that I'm actually close to the church, whereas to sit right out of the Grand Port. We were just talking about what could be compressibility of information, also have a sign of complexity to it. We understand complexity by understanding what it means to be random. So the highest degree of complexity may be equated with complete randomness, something that cannot be compressed, something that cannot lead itself to a repetitive scale, as in the example of xxy, 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 and so forth. Other measures of complexity focus on completely different properties. For instance, the fractal dimension, entropy, information correlation, grammatical complexity, hierarchical complexity. There is an abundance of measures which all use the same term but refer to very different properties. And although, as Casti points out, an amoeba is less complex than an elephant, whatever notion of complexity we subscribe to it, most of these measures make sense only if the complexity of the observer is also taken into account. And that is maybe one of the most important traits to this. We need to take the complexity of the observer into the notion. This puts complexity, just like fractality, into the eye of the beholder. Your eternal degree of complexity and the resulting structure of your observer perspective provides the context in which you recognize a structure or a process as simple or complex. Apart from the code, the medium of transmission and the message, context, plays an essential role in the generation of complexity. As a result, the complexity of a political structure, a national economy, or an immune system cannot be regarded as simply a property of that system taken in isolation. Rather, whatever complexity such system have is a joint property of the system and this is important, and its interaction with another system, most often an observer and/or controller. Casti. A further definition of measure of complexity, which explicitly takes account of the observer-context relation, will be introduced in the next chapter. It measures only the difference between the number of internal and external nestings, and takes into account whether or not the observer is aware of those nestings. In this chapter, I have suggested that an observer constructs a perspective by generating depth. He creates an invisible reference frame by representing objects at different extensions. A temporal perspective is generated by the nesting of multi-layered signals and reiterated retentions and pretensions. That is to say, the nested nows, with a capital N. I like those nows. Perspective is a relative ordering structure which presupposes simultaneity of different nestings. If we observe the contents of different nestings successively, or as Powers puts it, if time were just one damn thing after another, no perspective would arise, as no delta t depth would be generated. We are instead nested observers in a nested world. And I think it's funny that it's so frequent, I would say even especially in my own country, that everyone thinks that time is one damn thing after another, as Power says. That is an absolute absurdity. How on earth would time be possible to be that simple? That's a simplification that is just beyond belief, almost scary ignorant. We have looked closely at the structure of our temporal perspective, that is to say, our now, which is our only window to the outside world. And suggested that corrective distortions are adaptations to our present environment and anticipated future. Temporal corrective distortions are ubiquitous but reveal themselves only when our expectations are not met, as in auditory illusions or modified judgments of duration or temporal order. They may also be present in the form of delays or rhythmic mismatches, in disorders which result from problems of timing both within the human brain and body, as well between the individual and his context. These issues and the question of role of fractality might play will be discussed in Chapter 9. We have a lot to look forward to. I hope you agree on that point. We have talked about constraints on our perception, limitations to our perspectives. Many of these constraints arise from the fact, as we shall see in Chapter 4, internal and external perspectives display different levels of complexities. The difference in amount of visible nestings is the boundary which connect us to and separate us from the rest of the world, and which defines self and non-self. Let us now take a closer look at the structures of this boundary, which shapes our temporal perspective and perceptual event horizon. Should also mention Shepard. He wrote an article called Circularity and Judgment or Relative Pitch. George Buzaki, Rhythms of the Brain, where you can see how the rhythms of the brain interact with the external time to make objective time. And we have also Chinkel, Pöppel, Grenzen der Bewusstsein, wie kommen wir zur Zeit und wie entsteht die Wirklichkeit? Inseltaschenbuch from the year 2000. And we have Casti, Complexification, Explaining a Paradoxical World Through the Science of Surprise. Not to be forgotten, the Austrian scientist Chinkel, Perception of Simultaneous Auditive Contents in Simultaneity, Temporal Structures and Observed Perspectives. It's written together with Vrobel, and that was actually Vrobel's first book, if I remember it correctly. One book to look into, I think, would be the one of Air Powers, The Time of Our Singing, page 95, in common with other commentaries. Well, let's continue where we ended. Where I just ended. We are going to get further into this most interesting theme. Let's delve into Chapter 4, the view from within, extended boundaries. Our spatial and temporal perspectives are determined by the way we distribute simultaneous and successive nestings. In this chapter, we will first take a look at the structures of the boundaries which connect and separate such nestings. Then we shall investigate to what extent shifted boundaries can shape our perceptions and therefore our temporal perspectives. Next, we shall distinguish between visible and invisible interfaces and devise a measure of complexity which compares internal and external perspectives. Internalized models will be described as anticipative systems connected to projection. Finally, we discuss how different cuts produce different temporal perspectives and also discuss models and methods for identifying boundaries. If you have ever taken a holiday in the Tyrolean Alps, you have probably noticed that almost everyone, whether venturing to climb a nearby peak or just aiming for the next beer garden, is carrying a walking stick. Well, I have 5 at home. These sticks are typically wooden with a curved handle and capped with a metal tip at the end. Frequent use of such stick can turn it into an extension of the arm which carries it. Such a walker can often be seen directing his stick smoothly along the ground and striding fluently, almost effortless. The walker himself will notice a change in his proprioception. To him it may seem as he has grown an extra limb at the end, of which he now touches the world. We may say that there are 2 key interfaces at work here. The first is located at the spot where the hand grasps the stick. The second one where the now extended observer, consisting of walker plus stick, touches the ground. By incorporating a part of the world which was previously not assigned to our bodies, but to our environment, when the stick was still in the shop window, we form a new systemic whole. A systemic whole is defined by the relationship of its elements, which we experience as a unity. In particular, one of the significant characteristics of a system of this type is that there are properties of the whole that cannot be found in the elements. Good to remember that. This definition implies that the creation of a new systemic whole is an emergent phenomenon. That is to say, the whole is more than the sum of its part, and the elements, the 2 interfaces in our examples, are in experience as one whole, namely the boundary into which those interfaces have merged. Successful incorporation of a tool like a walking stick is perceived from the outside as fluency in movement and from the inside as merging of interfaces. One effect of this merging is transparency. The individual components of the extended system walker plus stick has become invisible to the walker when, though through frequent use, they are fused into one systemic whole. Incorporating a tool is a method used in, for instance, in robotics, when adaptive agents, that is to say, robots, which are capable of interacting with the environment and learning, are trained to develop smooth and effortless movements. It is also exploited in therapy when individuals suffer as a result of assigning parts of their bodies or minds to their environment and no longer recognize them as their own. An example of such misattribution is the condition known as unilateral neglect, when someone sees only one hemisphere of his normal visual field, or is convinced that, for instance, one of his extremities do not belong to his body. Such an individual selectively ignores a part of his egocentrically encoded space. For instance, he may insist that his left leg is not his, a conviction that does not change even if relatives or doctors point out to him that it is firmly connected to his pelvis. Another may be completely unaware of the fact that he's shaven only the left side of his face. This could be the case here. Or has eaten only the food on the right half of his plate. When such individuals who are blissfully unaware of their existence of one hemisphere are trained to use, for example, a stick as a tool for reaching, their visual field can be magically extended into the space which was hitherto neglected but which has now become reshapeable by means of the tool. The unexpected access to the neglected hemisphere is a result of the fact that our brain distinguishes between far space, i.e. beyond reaching distance, and near space, i.e. within reach. When we get used to employing a stick for reaching, we remap far space to near space. That is to say, a part of the environment is incorporated when the brain interprets the stick as an extra limb. We may at this point truly talk of an incorporation as opposed to a mere accommodation, because the process of assimilating the tool is accompanied by plastic neural changes. That is mighty interesting. And they also show the very great importance of using a tool for writing instead of not having a connection to the outside world with the tool. This enlarges our sphere of interaction. Let's also show the extreme importance of tool, so we don't become just brains in vats. And since we are embodied individuals who are not locked in, but flexibly interact through our bodies and minds with our environment, we constantly renegotiate the boundary between inside and outside, between self and non-self. As we have seen, the recalibration process can go both ways. We can become extended or reduced observers, depending on whether we assign part of our environment to ourselves, as in the stick example, or vice versa, as happens when a hemisphere of visual space is neglected. And I think that's incredibly interesting. We know today that the development during the Renaissance and later was hugely caused by the extension of our lived world by the use of tool. And it was especially the feather pen, the development of the articulation, the exquisiteness and the coordination of the pen that made it possible to expand literature, expand thinking, do administration. I think of the credit and debit of the northern Italians in Florence, Bologna, Pisa and so forth, the merchants of Venice and Genoa, how they extended their thinking by use of the pen. It's a complete disaster when we are giving up the pen. But I think behind this giving up of the pen is the idea that we are not existing in the world. The world is something completely different, and we are just free-floating souls in a sphere of empty space. this tragic effect will never ever happen in the East, where tools has become even more important. I read recently that the brush in Japanese schooling system has become even more sophisticated by the development of new tools for enhancing both color, concept of holding the pen, and also a more advanced training of that skill. We know that is about 95% of what we call intellectuality. So there we find yet another reason to understand how this new intellectuality, so to speak, by renaming and concepts only, has taken absolute space, and why we today are not listening to academia anymore. They are a small sect only, as interesting in the newspapers as some article about Scientology or some odd group of golfers who play underwater or something similar. They have zero influence today, whereas they used to be very influential when they still partake in the world and were interested in thinking and intellectual endeavors. I think this is becoming more and more pertinent in modern times as things go accelerating in the wrong direction, so to quote Ian McGilchrist. As I said before, I do not share his pessimism at all. I would rather say that there is a turn about to be happen. And I wouldn't say it has to get really a lot more worse before it turns. It has nothing to do with that. This is a new thing. If we hadn't had quantum mechanics and this recent development in neurology, it wouldn't have happened. So it doesn't matter if it would have been exponentially worse. It wouldn't turn things to anything good anyway. Things simply don't work that way. There is no Hegelian turn of reality like that. Inventions are not necessary. Explorations are not necessary. Sometimes it could be some very smart individual or creative person that changes everything, and he might not have been born. We should be happy that he has been born, or they have been born, that quantum mechanics has been established as the science without any comparison. Quantum mechanics doesn't have any pairs, even if you compare with all the science or what could erupt in the future. It's a unique event that might have not have happened. And I'm quite convinced these new developments within neurology has become more forceful thanks to the development in quantum mechanics. I think it internests everywhere. I have very hard to think that everything is sort of compartmentalized in knowledge. It doesn't really make sense. Fractality shows that within one area of knowledge, all other knowledge areas spread into each other. And we are going in more to this because susie Vrobel has an exploration within time. But it's very obvious that space and later also knowledge come into the doing. Just deconstruction. To give it just short term, just forget it afterwards. Susie Vrobel is a sort of a negative space taken on deconstruction, where she doesn't so much deconstruct as to show what we could have instead. I think that is quite accurate actually. Don't forget that. Remember it instead. I say thank you very much, and I wish you a very pleasant afternoon. Bye bye for now.